Hello. We're in a new month, May. It seems that time passes even though we are living in strange circumstances in one way or another. And of course, one of the good things as the year moves on is that we're moving through spring and starting to feel more of the warmth and the sunshine and the longer evenings that we enjoy always at this time of year. In our Easter reflections about new life, there's some updates. The blue tits are still incubating their eggs as we would expect, so there's not a huge lot of change there. But another lovely sign of springtime this year, some baby foxes out of their den and playing around in the sunshine. So we have lots to be thankful for, even though we also have lots of concerns and difficulties. In many ways, that sort of balance of good things and difficult things seems to have been part of the thinking that Jesus' friends were going through in these weeks after the crucifixion and the resurrection. Obviously, that whole crucifixion resurrection period was a complete turning point, not just for Jesus, but for his friends. They went from their initial despair, thinking that all the good things they were getting excited about and been enjoying were over, when he died, when they thought that that was the end. And then their bewilderment and their curiosity when they realized that wasn't the case, and actually resurrection was the beginning. It wasn't that death was the end. And so they move on into these uncertain weeks of working out what resurrection meant, and also relating some of what they'd heard Jesus say in the years beforehand, the stories that he'd been telling, and perhaps, at least for some of his disciples and his friends, understanding those stories with new ears and new eyes in the light of what was happening. The Gospel reading today comes from John chapter 10, and it's one of the familiar stories of Jesus. And I think we should look at it in that way, saying, well, this was a story that Jesus' friends and disciples heard sometime earlier, maybe didn't entirely understand, and now here it is to be heard and understood and interpreted in the light of resurrection and new life. This was a parable that Jesus told them, but they did not understand what he meant by it. So he spoke again. In very truth I tell you, I am the door of the sheepfold. The sheep paid no heed to any who came before me, for they were all thieves and robbers. I am the door. Anyone who comes into the fold through me will be safe. He will go in and out and find pasture. A thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. I have come that they may have life and may have it in all its fullness. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired man, when he sees the wolf coming, abandons the sheep and runs away, because he's not the shepherd, and the sheep are not his. Then the wolf harries the flock and scatters the sheep. The man runs away because he is a hired man and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. But there are other sheep of mine not belonging to this fold. I must lead them as well, and they too will listen to my voice. There will then be one flock, one shepherd. The Father loves me because I lay down my life to receive it back again. No one takes it away from me. I am laying it down of my own free will. I have the right to lay it down, and I have the right to receive it back again. This charge I have received from my Father.
So Jesus tells stories about sheep coming when they're called. Come on. Come on. Come on. Come on then. Come on. Come on. Come on. Come on. Come on, and there you go. Come on.
Well, I hope that helped you to understand how powerful some of the stories that Jesus told about sheep and shepherds really were. And of course he was talking to people who were familiar with sheep and goats and so on, being all over the place and all around, very much an everyday experience. So maybe those stories had more impact originally than they perhaps do for some of us now. But this idea of Jesus, God, as a shepherd, being able to call sheep, have sheep respond, is such a powerful metaphor. And so for the disciples in this period after resurrection, who were undoubtedly racking their brains to think, what comes next? Where do we go from here? This story would have been a sign of hope, a sign that Jesus had come and had even been killed and risen again in order not to do something for himself, but to do something for the whole of humankind. To gather God's people to him. To offer new opportunities, new ways of being. Of course, in these weeks after resurrection, it was much too early for people to start thinking seriously about church in any sort of formal way. It was much more a question of just going one day at a time and thinking things through and working out what might happen. But there's so much detail in that story about the vision and the mission that Jesus had. Up to the time of the crucifixion, you might think that a lot of his influence was actually on his disciples, on his inner cabinet, as it were, and that would be fairly true. But I think those same people were now, a few weeks after resurrection, beginning to think, hang on, this is something much bigger than we ever imagined. I'm sure lots of you, like me, will have enjoyed hearing the story of Captain Tom in Marston Moretain the last few weeks. Now Colonel Tom, of course, to give him his proper rank. And some movement that initially seemed quite small and local, just with a view of raising £1,000, ended up in a worldwide story about this amazing centenarian who brought £31 million of fundraising into the NHS charities. It's amazing, isn't it, how that took off? Just what one person and his family could do. And I think we have that same sort of sense about Jesus's followers in this time after Easter. They were starting small, they weren't sure where things were going, and yet I think at least some of them were starting to get the idea that maybe this was the beginning of something big. This was the beginning of something quite important to change the way of being, to change the world forever. That was Jesus' mission. That was his intention. That was God's plan. And so the metaphor of the sheep and being able to call them and bring them together was a really powerful illustration of that. It's a powerful illustration for us as church too. We can't say yet what's going to be the next chapter of church when things are back to a more normal way of life. I don't mean normal necessarily in exactly the same way as they always have been, because I don't think anything is going to go back to normal in quite the same way. But at least we will be moving on into a new chapter of church, of life, of all sorts of things. And whilst we may have a lot of concern, a lot of sadness about recent events, at the same time we have to say, well, perhaps this is an opportunity for a new start, for people moving together in different ways and moving into the future with more power, with more strength, with more love and grace. And surely that is Jesus' message for each and every one of us.
In our prayers this week, I'd like us to think particularly of families who are in sad places at the moment. Of course, that's always the case, but we recognise that while church is closed, at least the building is closed, it means that people are left a little bit on their own. Funerals are quite sad, with just a handful of people attending or allowed to attend at the moment. So we do particularly remember in our prayers the family of Roger, of Maisie, of Joan, but also so many other people who are in a state of sadness and to some extent having to cope with that alone. We pray too for our government, for our leaders. Complicated political, economic, health questions that have got to be somehow worked out together in order to plan the way out of the lockdown that we're currently in. We pray too for youngsters, for those who can't go to school, who can't go to college, to university at the moment because they're closed. Studying at home is not the same thing. It's sometimes difficult. We pray for them. We pray for other countries as well. Some countries that are so far less affected than ours, but in some cases more seriously affected than we are. And who knows where some of those epidemics are going to go as the weeks unfold. So all these things we lift to God in prayer. God bless you all this week.